Chuck Smith.
Really?
He used to say, Paul, if you don't use your gifts for the church more, the Lord's going to take them away from you. He's going to punish you. And he was more Pentecostal than I ever was.
Chuck Smith.
Yeah, he was. Well, he was supply pastor for the first Foursquare Church.
In a private interview, Paul Cain described his deep ties to Calvary Chapel leader Chuck Smith. According to Cain, Smith convinced him to maintain his connection to the latter-rain version of Pentecostalism and to, quote, use his gifts for the church more or face punishment from God. Cain expressed his growing disillusionment with the movement leading up to Smith becoming his campaign manager for the 1954 Madison Square Garden revivals in Phoenix. According to Cain, he was beginning to see through the fallacies of the movement and was moving away from it. At the time of Cain's alleged disillusionment, he was an emerging star in the healing revivals. Cain claimed that an angel had visited him and granted him the so-called gift of healing, similar to that of William Branham, who spearheaded the latter-rain revival. Branham, who would later use Cain as his proxy when he was unable to attend revivals in other countries, also claimed to have been visited by an angel. Converts to the latter-rain movement were captivated by these stories and were quick to accept such claims with little or no critical thought. In 1951, Branham held a series of revivals in Costa Mesa, where Chuck Smith and others would later launch the Jesus movement. Smith, then a leader in the Foursquare Church, was deeply involved in the latter-rain movement. The Foursquare Church was one of the sponsors of Branham's Costa Mesa revivals, and those events helped spread awareness of Branham's unique brand of Pentecostalism. Reader's Digest and other publications would later publish articles recounting the events, including the tragic story of Donny Morton, a child suffering from spinal meningitis and given only months to live. Donny and his father, Arthur Morton, had traveled over 3,000 miles to Costa Mesa for Branham to heal him, and Branham proclaimed, "Thus saith the Lord," that God had healed the boy. Though Donny died from the disease that brought him to the healer, Branham and his followers continued to believe that, even in death, the boy had been healed. It was during this period that Branham met Paul Cain, who would later become his protege. Cain apparently took inspiration from Branham's story of angelic visitation and the following year returned to the newly established World Church, led by O.L. Jaggers and his father, D.B. Jaggers, one of the founding figures of the Assemblies of God. The World Church had deep ties to the latter-rain movement as well as connections to the Foursquare Church. Not only was Jaggers frequently promoted in Branham's The Voice of Healing magazine, but he also sponsored Jim Jones, the founder of the People's Temple, who was a prominent figure in Branham's sect during the late 1950s. Why did Paul Cain, who had supposedly been visited by an angel from God, suddenly become disillusioned? If the angel had commissioned him to be a healer within the movement, why did Cain decide to abandon it after his 1952 revivals at the World Church? To understand this shift, we must examine a highly unusual story involving Cain's campaign funding and the nationwide manhunt for the Granny bank robber. While Paul Cain was ministering in Los Angeles, a surprising story was unfolding just blocks away. Local headlines began reporting a series of bank robberies committed by an unlikely suspect, a gray-haired woman in her 50s or 60s, soon dubbed the Granny Bandit. This woman, who appeared frail and grandmotherly, walked into banks with a disarming smile and an unwavering resolve, demanding money with a quiet threat of violence. The oddity of her approach and her age quickly captured the public's attention, turning her into a minor media sensation. The Granny Bandit initially robbed a California bank branch on Wilshire Boulevard, where she reportedly whispered her demands to a teller, brandishing what seemed to be a gun hidden in her handbag. Her approach was calm and collected, unlike the typical armed robber. She repeated this tactic at other banks over the coming weeks, amassing a modest sum but managing to evade capture. For weeks, the media followed her story, speculating on her motives and marveling at her ability to escape unnoticed. As her story became a fixture in local newspapers, it became apparent that this was no ordinary criminal. The Granny Bandit claimed she needed the money to help her friends and neighbors, even framing her actions as a modern-day Robin Hood mission. Her apparent charity, coupled with her unassuming appearance, only deepened the mystery. Was she a desperate woman driven to crime by unfortunate circumstances, or was there something more sinister at play? Meanwhile, as Paul Cain's revival meetings continued, he met a woman named Ethel Arata, who would later reveal herself as his connection to this bizarre criminal saga. Arata had been attending Cain's services and volunteered to help him with his Los Angeles correspondence. Eventually, Arata became Cain's secretary. Cain described her as a dedicated worker, quiet yet earnest in her faith. One evening, while Cain was discussing the growing media coverage of the Granny Bandit with members of his congregation, Arata quietly confessed that she was, in fact, the infamous robber. Cain recounted that she approached him hesitantly, stating, "I must tell you, I'm the Granny Bandit." When speaking with the news media, Cain claimed that he thought she was joking. Whether this was true or not, Cain admitted that Arata revealed that she had robbed the banks and claimed that she had done so out of a genuine desire to help those around her. This turned problematic when it was learned that she co-signed checks deposited in Cain's bank account for his evangelistic campaigns. News of Arata's confession quickly spread, transforming her from a mysterious bank robber into a figure of moral ambiguity. On one hand, she was a criminal who had broken the law. On the other, she was a sympathetic figure who painted herself as a reluctant outlaw driven by compassion. The public's fascination with her story only grew, and soon media outlets sought to connect her to the charismatic preacher she had been working with. Suddenly, Paul Cain found himself entangled in her story, surrounded by investigative reporters for national news media. Reporters began speculating on the possible influence of Cain's teachings on Arata's actions. Was she inspired by the message of charity and helping the poor that was often preached in charismatic circles? For Cain, the connection was an uncomfortable one, as he found himself trying to distance his ministry from Arata's criminal activities without denying the compassion that had led her to confess. Arata was eventually arrested and faced trial, where she spoke openly about her motives and her connection to Paul Cain. For Cain, the entire ordeal left a lasting impact. His experience with Arata raised complex questions about the nature of faith, charity, and moral boundaries. During her nationally publicized trial, Cain traveled from his base of operations in Texas to Los Angeles to support Arata. In the years that followed, the story of Paul Cain and the Granny Bandit became something of a legend. To this day, questions still linger about the full story behind Ethel Arata's motives and whether Cain's revival meetings played any role in her actions. How long before Arata was caught was Cain aware that his secretary was robbing banks? Did any of the money that helped launch his alleged angelic visitation stage persona come from the bank robberies? Paul Cain went on to have a lasting career in ministry and became one of the key figures in the New Apostolic Reformation. His connections to William Branham and Chuck Smith opened doors to other influential leaders in the latter rain and early charismatic movements, including John Wimber, a leader in Chuck Smith's Calvary Chapel movement and the founder of the Vineyard movement. Through Wimber, Cain was introduced to Mike Bickle and eventually became one of the so-called Kansas City Prophets, a group that helped pave the way for the International House of Prayer, IHOP, movement. Cain, Bickle, Wimber, and others also sparked similar revivals in Europe, launching new movements that closely mirrored the NAR. However, events from the early 1950s remain murky. While Cain cannot be directly implicated, some individuals associated with him were involved in questionable activities. During the same series of revivals, where Cain became affiliated with William Branham, Ku Klux Klan leader Roy E. Davis introduced his partner, former Congressman and fellow Klan leader William D. Upshaw, to Branham. In those revivals, Upshaw, who had been physically active for several years, posed as a cripple in a wheelchair during Branham's meetings to be healed. Just a few years earlier, Davis and Upshaw had made news in the same region, running an orphanage scam to fund the third wave of the Ku Klux Klan. Given that Cain's base of operations was near Dallas-Fort Worth, he would likely have been aware of Davis. Not only was Davis involved in the latter-rain revivals, but he was also deeply embedded in Fort Worth politics and outspoken against interracial marriage and integration. Moreover, Davis held a mentor-like role to Branham, similar to the role Branham later held for Cain. In a letter published by CFNI founder Gordon Lindsay, Davis even referred to Branham as his Timothy or protege. Though we may never know Cain's role in the crime spree that hit Los Angeles, one thing is certain. After the Granny Bandit robbed banks in the Los Angeles area, Cain went on to build an impressive career. During Cain's 1952 meetings, World Church taught lessons on Joel 3, the foundational text for latter rain's Joel's Army battle theme, which would later become a cornerstone of the new Apostolic Reformation movement. By 1954, Cain claimed to have received a vision of the end of days, which was made into a film and advertised in his interview with the Voice of Healing magazine. In the 1980s, both of these themes were revisited and used to help launch what would become the International House of Prayer in Kansas City, one of the primary revival centers for the NAR.